Yeah, I was going to add, it's such an interesting book that really just shows the diversity of our experience, as Black
Yes.
people. And I wanted to ask you, what does it feel like to have a piece of your story as part of this greater quilt of stories?
I guess I can just say I really feel honored, and I'm surprised that I'm in this collection, just reading about outstanding folks. We all talk about standing on the shoulders of those that came before us, and there's so many who are even more advanced in age than I am, who obviously, knowing what I faced coming along, you just can appreciate what they must have faced just being able to be successful, looking at the state of this nation in early years. And just some magnificent. I actually showed it. I have a busy nurse coming. I'm recovering from surgery, and
Mm.
I showed it to him. I had to pull the book away. I said, "I'm going to get a copy for you," but he was fascinated, and I think everybody who's seen it just fascinated because some people, especially those in celebrity fields or novelists, you recognize the names, but there are others that you just didn't know about, and reading their stories
Yeah.
and their personal reflections are really, and I'm just honored to be one of the group, part of the group.
Well, I love reading your story, and you've had a career where you have broken down so many barriers as a woman, as a Black woman. And I wanted to ask you, with having a career with so many firsts, what have been some of the greatest lessons that you've learned along the journey?
What I say when I'm speaking to, especially to young people who are just coming along, is to take note of the things that have been positive influences in your life. And at the same time, don't forget some of the negative influences or people who have given you, who have not been helpful to you. Because if you remember those, not just the good things, but the bad things,
Mm,
you can learn lessons from that about making sure you are not like those people. And one example that I give is that I think I'm known for mentoring. I'm not sure I really call it mentoring, but being available to students or professionals over the years. And so I'm sort of known for mentoring so many. And when I think about that, how did I really get into working with students, those coming along? When I was in medical school, as you probably saw, or I think it's in the book, I was the only woman, only person of color in my medical school class at a time when there were not many women in medicine. And there was only one woman full professor at my medical school at that time. And she made it clear right off at the beginning that she was a little bit arrogant and had no use for me and the nurses because we were the women who were around. She was wonderful to the guys. And when we had our class reunion, many of them spoke about her as their favorite professor that they remembered. And I went, "How could you say she
mm,
was your favorite professor?" And so I really didn't have a mentor. I don't think we called them mentors back then, but you would think as a woman in medical school there, and she was white, but you want to be able to speak to someone about some of the experiences you were having and to be reassured by another woman. And I could not go to her because I already knew the reaction because we'd had one instance when I saw what she was like. And so
wow.
I'd go home to my father, who was a physical education teacher. He was not a physician, but at least I could talk to him, and he'd let me come and comfort and give me fruit and then say, "Okay, go back and fight those battles. Don't stay here, go back." And so when I finished medical school and became an intern and and a resident in training, and my first faculty position, I wasn't that much older than students, but I found students, mostly Black, but even some white students, would want to stop by the Path Lab and talk to me about their experiences or get help or ask for suggestions. And I started doing that so much so that the dean of the medical school at that time said to me, "You're essentially mentoring. You're essentially doing what student affairs deans do. I might as well give you the title." And that's how I got started in medical administration, because he made me an assistant dean for student affairs. And people said, "Why do you do that?" And I said, "Well, I just remember when I didn't have anybody I could go to talk to. So when students come to me or other professionals come to me and they want to talk, I just feel I can't say no. I have to stop and listen to them."
Yeah.
And then reflecting back, I realized that that negative experience probably led to very positive actions of my part, because I don't want to be like her. I don't want anyone around me. I may not have all the answers, but at least I can guide them to someone else if I don't. But I just couldn't bear seeing other students or other young professionals be in a situation like I had been. So I use that as an example of how you can take a very negative experience and turn it into a very positive attribute as you look at your career over the years.
Yeah. And, as we talk about, what's been in the news lately is this, the importance of Black maternal health and the importance of having more women and more people, women of color in particular, when it comes to caring and advising, Black women when it comes to their health. And I know you've been an advocate for that as well. Can you speak to the importance of that?
Yeah, I think it's very, very important that Black women and women of color really, when we take care of everybody else, historically, we're known for taking care of everyone else, from times of slavery on up to current times, taking care of members of our family or in paid positions as caregivers. And the lesson is that we can't be good caregivers if we don't take care of ourselves. You've got to take the time to really, really pay attention if you've got a symptom or if you don't have a symptom to make sure that you are healthy so you can continue on. And of course, part of that means, and I don't like to use the term education, but having information, knowing what your choices are so that you can take part and make the decisions about your health care and what you're doing. And too often that has not been the case. We have, I think it's been said many and published in many treatises that that usually, not always, but usually having a physician of color with a patient of color,
Mhm.
patients seem to feel that they can speak freer about their experiences, especially if it's related to the impact of racism or negative experiences. And so patients tend to say more about themselves. Women are more apt to share, and especially if it's a reproductive issue, many women, especially women of color, really prefer to talk to someone who is a woman of color because they don't want to be embarrassed to feel whoever they're speaking to is not really aware, hasn't been through those issues. So, and looking at this whole issue of maternal health, I mean, just looking at the fact that the United States is the among developed countries is the only one that is seeing a rise in maternal mortality, in spite of the fact that we think we've got the best health care. But somehow something is happening that women aren't getting their prenatal care, or they're not getting the right follow-up after they give birth, because many of these deaths are deaths that could be prevented. And of course, looking at the whole issue of reproductive health and reproductive rights is a whole another issue that I think many women just don't understand until they get in a situation where they're in need of some of these services
Right.
or see someone in there. But and another aspect of this is that, and this is what I spent 20 years working on at NIH, and that is encouraging women of color and women and men of color actually to participate in clinical research, because when you see the treatments that are being touted or new treatments coming out, you really want to know. And I've been really pleased to see that women have learned to ask, did the trials include those like me? Are
Mhm.
we sure that this treatment is going to work for me when it's been tested in white men or tested in well-to-do white women? Can I believe it's going to be good for me? And and actually, and I've really been kind of discouraged because, when we started this inclusion thing back in 1991, and that was when we first got the congressional language requiring the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical trials. And that's why my office at NIH was set up. We ended up doing women's health research agendas and focusing on many other issues and career issues, which is what I'm still mainly working on. But our primary responsibility was to implement the congressional law requiring women and minorities in clinical trials. And people said back then, just as they're saying now, 30 years later, well, minority women don't want to be in clinical trials. That was not our experience. What I found in speaking to women, and especially women of color, that they often wanted to participate and wanted to know, how can I be in a clinical trial? They had just never been asked or had it explained to them what it was about. And so we found that it was not a matter of not wanting to participate, it was a matter of not understanding what participating meant. And many wanted to, how can I join a clinical trial? And so actually the ways to get in a clinical trial have been made much easier. And even back then, there were those who said, well, women and minorities don't want to participate because of Tuskegee, but we didn't find that to really be the case. And now, 30 years later, there are many who really don't know about Tuskegee. And I got very annoyed during the pandemic when they were looking for participation in clinical trials that so many were bringing up the Tuskegee study when we really kind of gotten past that and we're not paying attention to why there was a lack of trust in the medical environment, which by having a broader, diverse medical community really can help to overcome that. And I just thought, we spent 20 plus years working on this, and comes the pandemic, and they can't get minorities into some of these trials. Why not? Do they not remember the lessons that we learned 20, 30 years ago? Something's wrong with this. And that mainly was they didn't appreciate the fact that you need to have community involvement. You need to
Mhm.
explain to the members of the community what it's about, what is the value, getting the results back to the community, and not just taking an arrogant, like, I want you in my clinical trial, and not explaining it. So I was really kind of discouraged. And I'm glad that there's more effort now going on to encourage people of color to be in clinical trials, but it's also a little distressing to think that all of those lessons we learned before seem to have been lost. But I guess that's what happens with
Yeah.
history.
Uh, and I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to young girls who are really showing this interest in science and medicine? What advice would you give to them?
I do this all the time. I just say it's so exciting. Obviously I've been in medicine. That's all I ever wanted to do. Well, I think at one point I wanted to be a singer and a dancer, but I can't dance and can't sing, so I went back to medicine. But they look at the tough courses, but I say you can get through those. Just think what you can achieve, and regardless of what type of medicine you're in, whether it's clinical practice or research, the fact that you can do something to make a difference in the lives of people, a whole lot of people, or maybe even one person, to have a grateful patient say, thank you, doc, you saved my life, or thank you, doc, you've eased my pain. Thank you from members of the family because you've had an impact, mainly because you listened and then you went after the best possible way to handle whatever the problem was. It may not be something that needed treatment. It may have been something just for understanding what's going on and knowing how to handle your own personal behaviors. So I like to encourage young women, especially, to think about careers in STEM, especially in medicine and biomedical research, because it's so exciting to, you may not win a Nobel Prize, but you may just get a thank you one day, or a thank you card, or a bottle of cognac from a patient's family saying, doc, you made such a difference for me. And even when the patient doesn't survive, how you handle as the healthcare provider a
Mhm.
family that's undergoing grief can make such a big difference for the family. And you as the physician, or you as the scientist, are in a position to do that hardly anyone else can. And it's just so exciting. You don't mind staying up all night with a patient who's sick if you're making a difference, when you know that you can be there and make that patient get through the night and feel better. You don't really miss the sleep. That's been my experience, because you just feel good doing something to help someone else. And I don't know, they're not, I'm sure there may be other careers that those who are in them feel that same way, but it's not quite the same as dealing with people's lives to make them better or have them live longer. And I just tell them, think of the excitement of that, and what you could do. Or maybe you'll discover a disease that'll be named for you, or maybe you will get a Nobel Prize, or maybe it'll just be a plaque from your community group. But at least you know that you're doing something to improve the state of health and the state of well-being of an individual or a community.
You're in this beautiful book, but are there stories in this book that you've identified as some of your favorites? Are there things that you found out that you didn't know?
There are a couple of older women physicians who are in here that I know personally, and one who just passed this past year. Uh, but I knew them, and I had great respect for them. But reading about what they went through years before I did,
Mm.
uh, I was particularly stressed with those, let's say, especially those in medicine. and seeing what they went through. And I knew them and I see them at the National Medical Association meetings and I love them. But now I have even a deeper affection for them, reading what they went through. When I came through, there were very few women in medicine. Most of those who were very few blacks in medicine, except those who were at Howard and Meharry. And at least we've done something to change that. So they shouldn't be responsible for having to train all the black physicians. Other schools have a responsibility for that. But still, women were still seen as unique and they were still questioning whether or not women belonged in medicine back then. And that's what, and of course, I went to UVA at a time when segregation still existed in Charlottesville. So
Yeah.
knowing what I had to deal with and thinking what I went through in the 60s, looking at these women who came through in the 40s and the 50s before the 60s, I don't know how they did it, but
Wow.
speaking with Barbara Starks, who was the first black woman at UVA, and I told her so often I'm asked how to, and I was lucky to have her there because she was in the class ahead of me. And so often I'm asked, how did we get through?
Yeah.
And so her response was just tell them we had an eye on the goal. We knew where we wanted to do. We didn't take much stuff, but we knew when to stop because we were not going to let these distractions keep us
From
from
the
reaching
bottom.
our goal, which is graduating from medical school and becoming a physician. And I thought she really pinpointed that well. And I say to students today when they are facing racism or facing sexism and all, and I just say, just remember why you're there. And you don't take this stuff, but you can't get so caught up in responding to it that you lose sight of your focus, which is to become a physician or to become a scientist, because then that meets what they want to do to keep you out. And you just have to keep your eye on that goal. Don't let them step on you, walk all over you. But at the same time, don't let them get you so distracted that you forget why you're there and what you're doing. Keep your eye on the prize, as you can say, or
Mhm.
your eye on the goal. And I think that's what we did. And I'm sure that's what I saw as lessons from these other women who were ahead of me. And I just have to admire them. It wasn't easy when I came through. It certainly couldn't have been anywhere near easy for them.